The federal government is planning to introduce legislation today to allow asylum seekers to be processed offshore. It comes after that expert panel found asylum seekers who arrive by boat should be sent to Nauru and Manus Island for processing.
The coalition supports the return of Nauru but hasn't yet responded to the panel's report. The opposition's immigration spokesman Scott Morrison joins us now from Canberra. Good morning. Thanks for your time. Will the opposition support, as the government has done, the panel's 22 recommendations?
Well, as I said earlier this morning, the coalition of course supports the introduction of offshore processing on Nauru. It's our policy. It has been for over a decade. We're pleased that the government has finally decided to agree with the coalition's policy and act accordingly. I mean, only heaven knows what would have happened over the last 4 years if they'd agreed to this earlier, or even 6 weeks ago, when since 2,700 people have turned up, when the government rejected this very proposal just 6 weeks ago. So I'm pleased that the government has decided to back down on this, but there's still a long way to go on this issue. To stop the boats, we still believe you need the full suite of measures the coalition has always stood by: temporary protection visas, to deny permanent residence to those who come by boat, and also turning boats back where it's safe to do so. But 1 out of 3 in terms of going for Nauru, well, we've always asked them to do that, and we're pleased that they've finally relented and agreed to our policy.
So the expert panel's 22 recommendations, you don't agree to those completely, as the government has done in principle?
Well, many of those recommendations are already existing coalition policy, and the report largely endorses the approach that the coalition has been advocating on deterrence for a very long time. I mean, they've green-lighted Nauru, they've red-lighted Malaysia. They say it can't be proceeded with in its current form because the protections are not satisfactory. Now, that's exactly what the coalition said 6 weeks ago, 9 months ago, ever since it was announced in May of last year. So the coalition's position, I think, has been endorsed on that, as a result, we can get going with Nauru, but we do think they need to act on the coalition's other policies, which were in place last time, because at the end of the day, what matters is whether the boats stop, not necessarily what's agreed here in Canberra. And we believe the full suite of measures we've always advocated will do that job.
So, Scott Morrison, it's the same question. I'm going to ask it again. Do you support the panel's 22 recommendations in principle?
Well, the recommendations don't go to matters that require legislation, so that's a matter for the government. That's a matter for the government, and where they're seeking support in the Parliament for legislation to reopen Nauru, then they'll get that support for Nauru. But we're not about to agree to a backdoor reintroduction of the Malaysian people swap. That should be a matter for the Parliament. If the government ever can actually get those agreements that have been suggested out of Malaysia, well, I think that's a big test, and the Minister had said to me earlier last December that the Malaysian government wouldn't agree to those sort of changes. But look, that's a test for the government, and we'll see what happens there. But today, this week in Parliament, the coalition welcomes the fact that we can at least reopen Nauru, but to stop the boats, we think other things are necessary, in particular the policies that we had when we were last in government. Let's
talk about Malaysia then for a moment, because the panel has effectively backed what the opposition was saying in terms of the human rights concerns about unaccompanied minors being sent to Malaysia. If the government does do the work to address that and Malaysia agrees to that, why won't the coalition agree that Malaysia should be part of this regional solution?
Well, I don't think you should get ahead of yourself. I mean, that is a massive big if. I mean, what we have to understand here is we've got a government that has had failure after failure on all these other alternative methods. We've had the East Timor flop and the Malaysia flop. We had the asylum freeze farce, all of that. So, look, I'll let the government try and work through their last failed policy. What we know is today we can support proven policy, which is offshore processing on Nauru. That's what we've always asked them to do. It's what they've consistently rejected, demonised, criticised us over 10 years. And now the Prime Minister has had to climb down and admit that it was the wrong thing to ever have abolished it, because she's saying that by now saying it should be introduced.
But if those Malaysia concerns are addressed, why won't the coalition support Malaysia as part of this regional solution, which is what this expert panel was getting at, was that it needs a regional solution rather than just offshore processing on PNG or on Nauru?
because the Malaysian People Swap still doesn't have the green light. It still doesn't have any of the protections that are necessary, and the government has to achieve those things at the very least. And so I'm not going to respond to a hypothetical which I think has very little chance of actually being achieved. I mean, the government has failed in this area. I think they've got a record of failure, and I think the Australian people know who they can trust to implement these measures. I mean, the government has been dragged kicking and screaming to reopen Nauru, and I'm sure the Australian people have a little question, maybe a big one in the back of their mind, about their commitment to actually doing this right, given they've been so reluctant to do what has been obvious to everyone else.
Well, can you be really clear about which of these 22 recommendations the Coalition will support?
Oh, well, I don't think there's any necessity for that, because that's an action for the government. I mean, the Coalition's policy is clear. The Australian people know what that is. I don't think anyone's any doubt about that. The report that was released yesterday made it very clear that it is operationally possible to turn boats back where it's safe to do so. That's something the government has consistently denied. The path they've gone down on family reunion is consistent with our position on temporary protection visas. The other matters will not come into the Parliament, Karina. So, look, they're not things that necessarily require a coalition response. What requires a coalition response is what's going to happen in the Parliament. That's what the Prime Minister has asked for, and of course we will agree to our own policy, and subject to those details being worked through in the Parliament. The government doesn't try to slip Malaysia in through the back door when clearly it's been red-lighted by the committee.
But the panel didn't give the green light to turning back the boats. In fact, what it said was that that's something that could be considered further down the track should the country that the boat is being turned back to agree to the boats being turned back there. And at the moment, Indonesia doesn't agree to that.
Well, what you must have missed what I said, and what I said was the report said that it was operationally possible to turn boats back where it was safe to do so. And now that is something the government has consistently denied was even possible. They said it can't be done because the Navy says it can't be done. Well, the committee said yesterday it can be done, and the Coalition is confident that under a coalition government that we'll be able to implement that policy in exactly the same way as we did last time. That's our policy. That's what we'll do.
How will you go about implementing that policy?
As I've said, I don't know how many times on the ABC and everywhere else, we will implement this policy the same way we did last time. It's not a theory, it's a fact. It was actually done. And the panel yesterday confirmed that when it is done, when it is safe to do so, then it does provide a very significant deterrent. So we stand by that policy. There are others who may not agree with that. The government certainly doesn't agree with it, but we think it's necessary to stop the boats. And if you want that outcome, then we think that's very necessary.
OK, Scott Morrison in Canberra, thanks for your time. We'll leave it there.
Thanks very much.